Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got the newest power rankings for the Mythic Island metagame, breaking it down in detail with you with some new features at the end of the video as well, so stay tuned for that. But let's get into these power rankings. So let's start off with one of the hottest decks in Pokemon Pocket right now, fresh off of the release of Mythic Island. This is going to be Gyarados EX, Druddigon, and Greninja. I'm going to go over the criteria for each category as we kind of go through these decks and I rate them, and then at the end we'll have a power rankings, and I've got a cool little feature set up towards the end to kind of help you see everything, so stay tuned for that. But let's get into these power rankings, starting with this deck. So the early game, one of the biggest weaknesses that this deck has is going to be that Magikarp, right? And when you run into an electric deck that's playing Electabuzz or Zebstrika, you're always kind of living in fear that your Magikarp is going to get sniped. And then if you're running into any kind of deck fighting with the fighting energies, you're going to be worried about that Hitmonlee. You know, you're not going to be doing a lot of attacking, and that's why I gave this, this rating such a low score in the early game. But there is potential that people are just attacking into your Druddigon for whatever reason and then just racking up damage, making it easier for things like Greninja to finish, opposing Pokemon off, or, making a Gyarados sweep even easier. Leaf is going to help this deck tremendously and getting out of the active spot. And, hopefully soaking some damage while you're building your sweeper, which is Gyarados. And again, sweeper is one of those terms in Pokemon, if you're not familiar with it, where basically you're building up a Pokemon that comes in and just sweeps opposing Pokemon. So it just knocks out the majority or all of your opponent's team. Now, when it talks about being a slow builder, that's just kind of describing how sometimes, you're just attach an energy pass, attach an energy pass, attach an energy pass, because you're trying to stall and just build up your sweeper. Now, this is going to be one of those things that it can be good, it can be bad, but most of the time, because, you're going to have multiple bench Pokemon, you're still able to protect that Gyarados before it gets forced into the active spot. The Gyarados power creep, very relevant, very evident. Sure, Magikarp evolving into Gyarados usually has a drastic power, increase, but 180 HP on a stage 1, that's been pretty insane to watch go down. And not only that, it deals 140. It deals more than Starmie EX. Obviously, it's more expensive, and it also has, a lot more bulk. When you talk about, the consistency, Druddigon is going to provide a lot of, stalling time for you a lot of the time. And then the Misty is kind of the cherry on the top. But again, this deck, very strong in terms of my ratings and, has been very strong in the meta so far. Now, moving on to the next deck, and this is going to be the Pikachu variant of the week. So I try to release these power rankings every week, and then I try to also do a non-EX version. So definitely stick around and hit that subscribe button at the bottom right of the channel, so that way you can get notifications for these power rankings along with my other content. But the variant for Pikachu this week is going to be the Zebstrika variant, and it's strictly due to the Gyarados matchup. Now, Gyarados is really tanky and is going to survive almost everything in this deck, but if you can knock it out before it gets started, that's very helpful. And if you can use things like the double Sabrina in this deck list to force out Gyarados early before it's able to attack and start chipping it for damage, it can make your life a lot easier. Now, the early game for Pikachu, it's a 5 out of 5. I think it's the best in the game still. I think it's cheap, efficient damage, and it's the best pressure that you're going to see in this game. And hey, maybe times change that in the next, in the next January set. We'll see. But I do think that there's also great pivot potential because all of these retreats are pretty cheap. And then X Speed is an item card, so you can stack it with those supporters per turn. You can Giovanni X Speed, you can Sabrina X Speed, you can Research X Speed, and so on. And that really helps because some decks, there's times where you want a Giovanni, or you want a Leaf and Giovanni, or you want a Leaf and Misty, or you want a Leaf and Sabrina. And this deck, it doesn't really have to deal with that. But the speed of the attack is definitely the strength. It's capable of doing 90 early and consistently. But as power creep continues to happen, that weakness of Pikachu EX decks that I've been talking about since my first tournament win with Venusaur EX is that it's always been slightly glassy. And as more cards keep coming out and getting released and that power creep keeps happening, 120 HP is definitely proving to be slightly squishy compared to some of the other meta Pokemon. They're basically designing stuff to one-hit KO, Pikachu EX now, right? But again, this is one of the most difficult decks to brick with, and then again, it's limited on coin flips unless you just have to play towards the Zapdos, or unless you just have to play to the Dedenne, and then it can be reliant on some coin flips. So most of the time, this deck is very straightforward in what it's doing. So again, that's my rating for it. You can kind of see the numbers there. Very, very strong deck. The next deck that I'll be talking about is Mewtwo and Gardevoir, and technically, when I look at this deck, I do think that, there's some spots that maybe you can change around, but I do think that 2 Sabrina is probably necessary for that Gyarados matchup. Maybe you're just able to knock out 2 Druddigons and then, finish off a Greninja, because again, knocking out a Gyarados is going to be a tall order to do unless you can line your Jinx up with it and then move in your Mewtwo. Very tough to do. But again, looking at these ratings, it's a pretty expensive attack, 2 energy for 50 damage, but you're also setting yourself up so that way if you do drop a Gardevoir, you can just Gardevoir attach an energy to Mewtwo and then manually attach an energy to Mewtwo, and boom, you're doing 150. So it can be all right. It can scale. Jinx, not great in the early game, depending on the matchup. You're going to probably really like it against Celebi and those superior decks, but again, just one of those things that it's a one prize attacker, and that's why it's in this list. The power of this deck is that 150 damage. That 150 damage is going to take care of a lot of decks in the meta. The only decks that it's not going to really do too much to are maybe those Charizard decks, and obviously those Gyarados decks. Like Gyarados just has really good stats against Mewtwo. Gyarados kind of owns Mewtwo, to be real honest. But again, don't forget that Mew in the mirror match is going to be huge, and then Mew against Charizard can also help ease that matchup. It can copy Charizard's attack and do that 200 to it, knocking it out, and then continue, putting pressure on your opponent. So Mew, very, very good card for this deck. But again, Mewtwo's just been exposed a little bit recently because of Gyarados, and then Mew has even less HP, so that's an issue too. But this deck has gotten slightly more consistent, in my opinion, with Slab. I think you probably want to save your Slabs for turns that you really need to find a Psychic Pokemon or find your Stage 1 or Stage 2. I think that's probably the best way to play Slab. Just kind of sit on it until you absolutely need it, instead of just ripping it right away. But again, Mewtwo, very strong deck. Once it's online, it's very hard to beat. But Gyarados can just straight up wall it in similar ways that Charizard was able to wall Mewtwo in previous genetic Apex tournaments. Okay, moving on to the grass decks. This is going to be Celebi, Executor, and Superior. And you'll notice there's 1 Snivy in this deck, so that's a little bit more, it's a little bit different from some list, but I do think that if you're playing Celebi, you probably need to play Executor. Like, I think Executor is kind of like one of the best things about grass types, because of things like Executor. Your early game can be really, really good, especially if you evolve Executor early. And then on top of that, Celebi attacking for 2 energy is not bad either, especially if you can get your Superior going on curve. In that middle to late game, that Celebi can really pile up some energy, especially if you're able to land that early Executor and just start swinging with the Executor while you build up that Celebi. The power is going to be super influenced by coin flips. Like, that's just the way this deck is. This is going to be a classic Pokemon TCG deck where sometimes you're just flipping tails, and the reason you're losing is because you're flipping tails, right? But there's going to be some games where you flip average and you win games because of it. So that's just something to think about as you think about playing this deck. In terms of health, Celebi and Superior are prone to being one-hit KO'd. However, Executor is pretty bulky, and that's where cards like Erica can really change the game, right? You can swing into Druddigon with your Executors, and then know that you're sitting on some Ericas. Again, the consistency issue, you're kind of hoping for decent coin flips, especially when you get to those late game attacks where you're sending in Celebi and you're trying to flip 4 or 5 coins. And then obviously you're definitely hoping to hit your evolution. So that's why you're seeing that score and consistency be a little bit more average than above average. All right, moving on to Golem and Druddigon. Now, this deck took down the Ursi tournament this past weekend, the largest tournament of the weekend, and it caught a lot of eyeballs. However, that person literally dodged, every Celebi deck. And then as we've seen this deck get played more in other tournaments, we're starting to see more data on it. Now, one thing that I'll point out about the deck list is that this deck list has 2 Hitmonlee as opposed to 1 Hitmonlee, 1 Mars Shadow. That's, strictly just personal preference. But when I look at across the table and I see Gyarados, I'm hoping that I have double Hitmonlee, right? So that's kind of one of the big reasons why you see double Hitmonlee. The early game is mostly stall and snipe. When you get to that mid to late game, you're hoping that you have that powerful Golem ready to go, and then your other cards like Hitmonlee are just kind of sitting, hopefully able to finish things off if needed. But this is also a 1 prize deck, so you don't mind, trading knockouts if you can get to that point. But again, this is just going to be a slow build up. Unless you get lucky with multiple Brocks on your Golem. And then, again, the thing about the damage reduction, when you talk about the power of this deck, the damage reduction is going to help a lot of 2-hit KOs for Golem, and then it's going to help it survive, right? So it's going to help it 2-hit knockout things because it survives longer, and that's some good synergy there. However, it is a little bit pricey, and you're probably only building up 1 per game. Unless the game just really drags out. But the consistency is another issue, as well as the health. When you take a look at the health and the HP of these Pokemon, the only Pokemon that's not considered quote-unquote classy would probably be Golem, right? 100 HP is decent, but you're still seeing a lot of people be able to do 100 damage in 1 turn. And then when you take a look at the consistency, the bricks with this deck are going to feel really bad because there's really not a lot of comeback cards in a deck like this. In a deck like this, you're really hoping to not brick. And I would say even more so compared to any other deck that's on this list. Like this deck, when you brick with it, it feels like you just maybe lost on the spot. Compared to other decks, hey, there are ways to, soak damage and pivot out or eventually find that thing that you needed to evolve and win the game. But with this deck, it's just the bricks feel really bad. But again, great sniper, a little bit of a lack of bulk, but again, for a 1 prize deck, very, very strong. Probably the best 1 prize deck that we've seen so far. Now we're getting to the fire decks. So I've got 3 fire variants that I'm going to show, and we're starting with Arcamew. So it's got Arcanine EX, Mew EX, and Moltres EX. This is going to just rely on, hopefully you open Moltres, right? Hopefully you open Moltres, Growlithe, maybe Moltres, Growlithe, Mew, whatever. But you want that Moltres. Leaf is going to help this deck a lot because not only is Leaf going to help get your Moltres out of the active, it's going to help pivot your Arcanine as well. That 120 damage, it's a little bit of a hard cap, and it's kind of an issue in some matchups. However, if you can get it online quick, that 100 damage can do a lot of work if you get it out quick. So if you high roll your opponent with those heads on Moltres and you drop that Arcanine on curve, you can win a lot of games. However, it's one of those things that may not happen a lot. The other issue with this deck is every EX that's in this deck gets 1-hit KO'd by Gyarados and Mewtwo. There's really, sure, maybe you could squeeze in blue. I don't know, maybe take out one of the X speeds, maybe take out one of the Leafs, maybe take out the red card, maybe take out the potion, whatever. But again, that's a big problem for this deck. And then in terms of consistency, it's going to rely on stage 1s with some coin flips. Personally, I'm not sure that I enjoy this deck too much, simply because it just depends on Arcanine on curve so much, and then sometimes you just get swept because you don't find the Arcanine, and that feels really bad. But overall, I think it's a decent deck, but I think I might prefer other fire decks. Now, Charizard EX and Moltres EX is a deck that has a weird plus side. Charizard has quite a bit of bulk, And unless, Gyarados has that Greninja already on board, Charizard might be able to answer Gyarados if you're able to, power it up and get it lined up with the Gyarados. The other thing is that 180 HP is very difficult for some decks like a Mewtwo, and can even be difficult for decks like a Golem because they only have one shot to really, knock out your Charizard, and they're hoping that, Hitmonlea's chips some damage before Golem goes in and tries to finish it off. So really interesting here. And then the addition of Mew to this deck also can do some things, maybe help out the Mewtwo matchup, maybe it helps out the mirror match, but overall, again, it's got the same issues in the early game. In the mid to late game, if you can find Charizard and flip some heads, Charizard can just straight up sweep. But again, this is the highest guaranteed damage to one Pokemon in the game. 200 damage is gonna one-shot everything. And even when you talk about the health, the health is a good plus, but again, you got to be worried about, has your Charizard hit a Druddigon, or has your Greninja hit your Charizard. So that's the only kind of issue there with the health. But consistency wise, it's a stage 2 attacker, it's going to rely on coin flips, but again, Mew can definitely provide some coin flips. Overall, Charizard EX, huge problem for most decks. It really is. But the consistency is the main issue. All right, so we're going back to a genetic Apex favorite, Arcazard, also known as Zardcanine, however you want to call it, whatever name you want to call it. But this is that fusion deck of Arcanine and Charizard. And, let's just be honest, the early game is still the same, right? You're super reliant on that Moltres. You're hoping to find either Arcanine or Charizard. And then that mid to late game, Leaf, extremely important for retreating any of the Moltres or any of the Arcanines that get stuck, even a Charmeleon that gets stuck, right? But the combo of power and speed, it can actually counter every deck in the game. If you high roll with Arcanine, you can counter almost everything, right? If you high roll with Charizard on curve and you're flipping heads with Moltres, like Charizard can just come in and sweep everything and not worry about it, right? But the power creep in the game has started to impact the health rating of this deck. Like before, Arcazard was really nice because all the EX Pokemon were like really hard to knock out. But obviously now with Mewtwo being more consistent, now with Gyarados being a thing, now with more Druddigons, like dude, and Greninjas, the health issue is a little bit more difficult. And then don't forget the consistency issue. The consistency issue of needing to find specific evolution pieces as you play the game, like that's a problem, right? But again, this deck doesn't brick as much as you would think it would, looking at it on paper. That's why the deck was pretty successful. And again, the deck does have bright spots, right? Arcanine, if you get it going fast, really strong. Charizard, really tough to one shot, and then it's gonna probably take care of at least one Pokemon before it gets knocked out. So again, there are definitely pros and cons to this deck compared to the other fire decks, and I did give this deck the highest rating out of the fire decks. So this is a new part of the power rankings that I wanted to show you all, and this just kind of highlights how I rated all of the decks compiled into one place. And as time moves on and I add more decks to this list, we'll be able to kind of highlight and compare and contrast. And this is a time for you as a viewer. Maybe you can kind of say, hey, MBB, I think you were wrong about, Arcamew's mid to late game compared to, maybe a Celebi deck. This is a time for you to be able to say, hey, I disagree with this and here's why. And I would love to see that in the comments, because I do want to make these power rankings as good as possible, and I think that dialogue like that is really healthy for the game. But let's talk about the best ratings for each of these categories. So in the early game, Pikachu and Celebi to me had the strongest early game out of all of these decks. That they don't necessarily rely on too many coin flips to get started. Like if you have 2 energy on Celebi, like sure, you're going to flip coins for the attack, but you can already start putting that pressure on your opponent. Mid to late game, I said that, hey, Gyarados, Mewtwo decks, and Arcazard decks have the best mid to late game. When you talk about power, I said Gyarados, Mewtwo, and the decks with Charizard in it had the best power. And then when you talk about health, I said Gyarados, and then again the Charizard decks. And then in terms of consistency, Gyarados again However, you did also see Pikachu and Mewtwo in these ratings, and so hopefully these ratings make sense. I tried to kind of compare and contrast and try to take a look at the coin flips that are involved and the evolutions that are involved to come to a conclusion on scoring these ratings. Overall, this is what I had in terms of the ratings. And you'll notice that Gyarados is the number 1 deck in my eyes, even though it does tie a score with Pikachu. I've got Pikachu second. I've got Mewtwo EX third. And then although Celebi EX did score lower than a couple of the Charizard variants, I do have it as 4th place. And that just kind of goes to show that just because a deck has a higher rating in the power rankings, I don't necessarily mean that I think it's the better deck. Sometimes matchups really do matter. Sometimes the amount of people bringing a deck to a tournament matter. And so again, hey, always keep that information and that data in mind when deciding what deck to bring to a tournament. When you talk about number 5, I got Arcazard, number 6, Pure Charizard EX, number 7, Golem, and then number 8, Arcamew EX and Mew EX. So I hope that you enjoyed the new first week of power rankings for Mythic Island. This is the 6th week I've done it overall, and if you want to see more power rankings like this, definitely smash that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed it as well, what other decks you might want to see. I left off Celebi because I just think that deck kind of stinks. That's just me. But anyways, closing this out, appreciate you for tuning in, for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe you learned something, maybe I entertained you, but until next time, peace.